I would suggest that you take your question and generalize it, not to the United States, but to any great power. Okay, so are the politics of any great power undertaken out of an intention to create benefit and help the people of the world? I think you have to really look hard to find examples. Great power actions don't take place in a social and economic vacuum. They're carried out effectively by the concentrations of power within the society. That differs in different societies. Like in the old Soviet Union, it was the Kremlin, party apparatus. In the United States, the corporate sector. Okay, so if you want to understand policies, a good place to look is the interests of those who formulate them. And it's very rare that they act in the interests of others. Who would expect that? And of course, the intellectual classes have to write a story which says they're always acting in the interests of others out of pure altruism. But that's almost universal throughout history, so we discount it. And we ask what they're actually doing. And yeah, sometimes it happens to be beneficial to others. So take, say, humanitarian intervention, use of force in violation of international law. Well, if you take a look at the post-World War II period, you can find a few cases where use of force did put an end to major atrocities. Now, they don't enter into the canon. We don't talk about them. And the reason is because of who carried them out and what the U.S. reaction was. The only two cases I know of any significance are the Indian invasion of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, in 1971, which did stop huge massacres, and the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1979, which put an end to Pol Pot's atrocities just when they were peaking. So they had, very humane consequences. Were they humanitarian interventions? No, because those weren't the intentions. Those were the consequences. But why don't they enter into the canon? Well, because it wasn't us. We didn't carry it out. Rather, it was them. And what they do can never be any good. Furthermore, even worse, the United States strongly opposed both of those interventions. It threatened war with India. It sent aircraft carriers into the Bay of Bengal to threaten them for this crime. In the case of Vietnam, I mean, they were just bitterly denounced for putting Pol Pot's atrocities to an end. The U.S. supported a Chinese invasion to punish them for the crime. And the U.S. immediately turned to supporting Pol Pot. Well, okay, so therefore their intervention can't count as humanitarian. But try to find some other examples. So yes, there are cases where the use of force happened to have benign effects, but not because it was carried out with humane intent, and the cases don't count unless we did them. When we did them, it either succeeds in crushing resistance, in which case it's hailed as a great achievement, or it fails, in which case we say, well, it was a mistake, our benign intentions couldn't be realized. That's the canon of intellectual history. We see it right now, for example. So take, say, Iraq, and take a roughly comparable example, Chechnya. Okay. In Chechnya, first Yeltsin, then Putin responded to Chechen terror, really significant Chechen terror in Russia, with a vicious invasion which destroyed the capital city, Grozny, killed tens of thousands of people. And then, according to U.S. reporters who've been there, it ended up very successful. New York Times reporters visiting say Grozny is a booming city. Construction everywhere, everybody has electricity, no Russian troops around. It's run by Chechen security forces. I mean, there's some guerrillas off in the hills somewhere. We don't call that a success. We call it a crime. They succeeded in pacifying and reconstructing the country, and now it's working pretty well. And we consider it a crime, rightly. All right, now let's take the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Well, if General Petraeus had been able to even minimally approach what Putin achieved in Chechnya, he'd probably be crowned king. He hasn't been able to achieve that. But so instead of the country survives I mean, Baghdad, for example, is a gated city, which people can't go from one place to another. And there's been massive ethnic cleansing, so killing has reduced because there's nobody to kill anymore. The militias have been armed, trained, and funded, so they control their territory, so violence is reduced a little. The place is a total wreck. There's maybe 1 million people killed, a couple of million displaced and refugees, but it's kind of, violence somewhat reduced. So not as successful as Putin in Chechnya, but, to some extent kind of reduced the level of violence that we created in the first place. And that's praised across the spectrum. Say, okay, the question of the surge, let's say, is settled because look how wonderful it was. I mean, nowhere near as wonderful as Putin in Chechnya, but nevertheless, we did it, so it must be right, even if the place is left a total wreck that may never recover. Well, okay, that's the way within our doctrinal system we look at the use of violence by ourselves and others. And this translates to others. They do the same thing. Now, is the use of violence ever permissible? Well, I'm not an absolute pacifist would say no. I don't agree. But I think there's a very heavy burden of proof. You want to use violence, whether it's a domestic dispute or international affairs, you have a very heavy burden of proof to meet. And I think if you look carefully, it's very hard to meet that burden. And the cases that are accepted, whether it's personal relations or international affairs, just don't stand up, almost without exception.